It's extremely difficult to predict the future of art, and it's actually not a very good thing to think you can, because it's the function of really creative art to surprise one. There's the old story about Sergei Diaghilev, who was being pestered by the French poet Jean Cocteau, who was ambitious to be part of the inner circle of the Ballet Russe, which was the latest thing in pre-war Paris. So Cocteau was saying, Sir, what do I have to do? What do I have to do? And Serge ran it down on him and said, Étonne-moi, surprise me. Well, I think that what we have inherited from the modernist situation is that we need to be surprised. That is, to try and predict what will happen is always a doomed enterprise. But one can at least see certain patterns, which is why I wrote a book called Art Tomorrow. Incidentally, to my huge amusement, Art Tomorrow is now the title of an extremely new, very beautifully printed periodical on contemporary art, which is being published in Tehran. Well, I think that what one knows is that all establishments in art have got to fall. That art lives by change, and never more so than in the contemporary epoch. And one of the reasons it lives by change is that it is linked to economics and it's linked to technology. One of the things which conceptual art has failed fully to take on board is the new technological capacity for image making. That is, one of the things you find very often and very interestingly about so-called new academic artists and technology is that they are not infrequently very into digitization, that they're very into computers. I've just been writing a piece about a Chilean artist called Munoz Vera, Guillermo Munoz Vera, who has just done a series which is called Terra Australis. And Terra Australis is the name given by the old geographers to a supposed southern continent which would balance the northern ones. And of course it didn't exist, but they were convinced that it did. And what Munoz Vera has done is to make a series of pictures, many of which look exactly like the old masters, but which could not have been accomplished in our own day without the use of digital cameras and this kind of thing. But they do the old themes, the vanitas, they have astrolabes, they have globes, this kind of thing. But what one realizes is that he is constructing an ironic fiction. That is, he knows, because he lives in our own time, that Terra Australis did not exist. But he is examining the myth of a future where it did exist, and creating a whole imaginary world where it actually was not merely a possibility but a fact. And one of the most telling of these pictures, which is called The Geographers, shows a man in apparently an ancient brick building looking out of a sort of balcony. You can't see what he's looking at. He's dressed in early 17th century costume. And in the background there is in a room which is crowded with globes, books, etc., hanging on the wall there is the famous Vermeer, of the geographer? Well, so that you already have not merely a series of receding planes, technically, but you have a series of historical illusions. But the interesting thing about this is that we actually seem to know who Vermeer's model for the geographer was. And the answer is that he was a scientist called van Leeuwenhof. And he was not a geographer, but he was the person who discovered the existence of very small living organisms which could not have been seen without the development of lenses in the 17th century. So at the end of this train of thought, what you get is that the fact that it's Leeuwenhof suggests the existence of a parallel world, that is, of little tiny things which you can't see except through the lenses, which live in an independent way from ourselves. Well, in a certain sense, this sounds like conceptual art, but it isn't, because you can see everything. Everything is presented to you. You need no special knowledge to make your way through the first layers of meaning. You may follow up by looking by checking out who the person in the Vermeer actually is, and this kind of thing. But the first steps are steps which anybody can take. And I think that the problem for the present art world, with its extreme official emphasis on conceptual works, is that it's a supposedly democratic world which nevertheless seems intent on shutting people out. Well, the first time, or the model for a similar situation, is not difficult to find if you are acquainted in any way with European art history. And that is, the last time we had this learned detachment from the popular was in the late 17th century, when mannerism was declining, particularly in a situation which existed particularly in the Italian intellectual world. An echo here, of course, you realize that this is also the world of Galileo. Lenses again. But in that world, if you look at late Mannerist art, it's always in search of the esoteric. And it is very frequently preoccupied with quotation. And if you look at much so-called modern, contemporary, postmodern art, what is striking about it is its obsession with quotations. That it is an art which samples. People say it's abstract. Well, it's not. I mean, to say it still deals in images, but these images are always borrowed. Well, what happened? Why did things change? Well, they changed because in their day, that day, though things moved more slowly than they do nowadays, there was a revolt against the existing situation. And the revolt took the form of a sudden fascination with the demotic, what one would call demotic, non-classical realism, of whom Caravaggio is always regarded as the prime example. Well, if you think about Caravaggio, the truth is that he emerged from mannerism, that he wasn't born, it wasn't just, oh, I'm going to be a realist, oh, it's my impulse. Realism had always been part of the Mannerist armory. It was used for shock. You think of the Parmigianino self-portrait when, as a youth, made to impress Pope Clement VII, where he shows himself as if reflected in a convex mirror. Well, it's this kind of thing. The last shock available to the artists of Caravaggio's generation, if they were prepared to use it, was the leap into extreme realism. Well, if you look at the situation now, it seems to me that for young artists, almost the last shock available is the same thing. That is, how do you rebel against the conceptual situation? Well, you rebel against it by realistic representation. The situation is further complicated by the fact that realistic representation is no longer the property of the artist using traditional techniques, that he or she is in possession of an extremely wide variety of ways of making images. Not merely the camera itself, but digitization, the use of the computer, all of this kind of thing. Well, rather than viewing technology as the enemy of traditional painting, as the enemy of the anti-conceptual artist, I think it needs to be viewed as the ally, and that you need to think of the thrust towards a new kind of realism as being possibilities which are offered by a wide variety of technical means. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of realism? Now, I think that question goes in two different directions. One is to do with style. That is, do we regard classicizing pictures as realist? Because neoclassicism represented, in the first instance, it was the first art movement which was invented by theoreticians, not merely interpreted by theoreticians, but invented by theoreticians. And so the idea was to impose a universal style on art which was derived from classical models, which didn't prevent realism. But if you look at the work of Jacques-Louis David, one of the most prominent of all neoclassical artists, you'll find things which are mythological pictures which seem extremely artificial. But you also, if you look at the end of his career, and particularly at his late portraits, you find one of the most powerful realist artists who ever existed. I mean, his pictures of his ugly daughters and his ugly son-in-law, and of himself in middle age, are astonishingly realistic and have nothing to do with general ideas about classicism. But the other thing which I think you have to think about is technical. And that is, there's been a great deal of talk recently, fomented by artists like David Hockney, about the idea that artists must have used optical devices. That is, before the camera, there were still optical devices which used lenses. And these were clearly used by some artists. I mean, say, an artist where you can prove it is Canaletto, and you can probably prove it about Vermeer as well. Well, what you have to think about there is the fact that the camera, like the camera I'm looking at now when you're interviewing me, is a single eye. It's not a pair of eyes. And that has implications about the way things are seen, because our perceptions of depth and solidity depend on the fact that we have two eyes, not one. And So I think the challenge for the realist painter in particular is that it's actually a different way of seeing. It isn't the same as the way you see if you're using a camera, and it certainly isn't the kind of image which you produce if you are simply copying what the camera gives you. That is, photorealism is arguably not realism at all. So I think what we are quite likely to see is a return to the struggle to represent things as they are fully seen, by which I mean representations which take into account the way that eyes actually work. One of the striking characteristics of the more naive kind of photorealist painting, which would, I think, be rejected by the paintings you call neo-academic in Russia, is that the level of focus is the same all over the surface. That is, if you look to the most remote corner of the work, that is as fully in focus as the most central episode, the thing you're really meant to be looking at. Well, the realist painter models, and what we are, I think, beginning to have, if I'm offering any kind of prophecy for the future, is that I think that there's going to be a huge push in technological terms towards fully three-dimensional representation, and that videos, artwork, films, artworks of all kinds will strive to do away the need for a special pair of spectacles and to produce images which seem to project fully into space. Well, oddly enough, this is something which many painters have already known how to do. That is, if you think of a number of quite celebrated paintings, objects seem to float in front of the plane of the picture. And a good example of that would be Caravaggio's head of Medusa on the tournament shield in the Uffizi, which is the direct successor of the Parmigianino I was talking about, the Parmigianino, the self-portrait in a convex mirror. And in Caravaggio's painting, which is on a tournament shield, which is already convex, the head of Medusa appears to float in front of the picture plane. It's illusionist. And the blood from the severed head drips into space. Well, I think it's these kinds of things which painters are going to have to grapple with, painters in particular. The situation of the sculpture is different because sculpture is three-dimensional already. And that opens all sorts of fascinating possibilities. But what it also opens is a series of questions which are social and political. The art of the museums, which is very often openly conceptual, that is, the museum authorities in places like Tate Modern, the Pompidou, Museum of Modern Art, are feeding conceptual ideas to a mass public. The museum has to do a great deal of interpretation when this happens, but claims that it is essentially democratic. I think without a doubt any art which is housed in a museum must be regarded as official, that a museum is an official institution. And museums justify the public and private subsidies which they receive on the grounds that they are entertaining and informing a popular audience. But they also stand between that audience and the work very often. That is, the public is subjected, I use the word subjected in several senses, to a process of interpretation, that it is told what to think. Well, the kind of art I'm talking about, which might be coming back into visibility, doesn't need that kind of interpretation, or it doesn't need it at first encounter. That is, yes, there may be a need, a possibility of explaining symbolisms, hidden meanings, that kind of thing, but your first encounter with the work is direct. So what I suppose I'm hoping for is an art which doesn't give up innovation, because that's the death of art anyway, but an art which will find ways to cut out people like me. That is, that I will not be as necessary as an interpreter as perhaps I have been in the past, or maybe am in the present. And that is, I am really looking for the suicide of the critic.
Right.
And I think that would be a very good thing. Listen, no, there are critics in the past who are always interesting to read. That is, if you read Diderot, the Salons, they are fascinating, but they're not the way we would talk about art now. Diderot, for example, nearly always sees paintings as frozen episodes in plays. That is, he's interested in narrative, and he is interested in his favourite artist, Greuze, as a creator of narrative scenes. He talks very little, if at all, about what we would call composition. If you proceed forward to, let us say, Bernard Berenson or Roger Fry, who also for reading, you find a complete reversal. And that is, you find them tending, especially when they tackle the art, Berenson in particular, the art which is not of their own time. They're the great masters of Renaissance. Berenson talks in terms of form and composition. He does not talk about the biblical narratives which the paintings are often about and which have been primary for the original audience. Well, there are certain reasons for this, of course, and that is that the biblical narrative, even in Berenson's time, was no longer absolutely in the forefront of people's minds. That the unitary culture, literary culture, was breaking up. Even in his time, people no longer had the basic Bible story, the basic classical myths in the forefront of their minds. So he had to find another way to bring them to the pictures. There was also the fact, and I hope I can say this without sounding anti-Semitic, that the new clientele, especially the American clientele, for the old masters, which people like Berenson and the dealer Devine were buying in Europe and selling to American clients, those plutocrats were largely Jewish. And so, in order to sanitize Christian pictures for them, you had to focus on the so-called tactile values, on the formal values, rather than on the religious narrative. So it's not just that art changes in itself, it's also that the way in which we read art changes all the time. And that's why it's educational to read Diderot, to read Berenson, who are perceptive men, even if in the end you don't agree with the word they say. It's at least educational to see what the point of view is. Well, I think that the point of view, the way we look at, receive art, is always in a state of flux. And that flux is what interests me. That state of change is what interests me. And I hope I am never resistant to change. That is, I know it's changing. And I also know that you can never, as the proverb has it, step into the same piece of water twice. You step into a river once, it's not the same water as you step into when you step into it again 5 minutes later. So all I can do in those circumstances is to suggest possible interpretations, but to leave them to other people to develop as the situation continues. That is, I am the last person to say as a critic, even if I have confidence in my own judgment, that I'm always right. In fact, I'm always going to be wrong. The term kitsch is a catch-all for what people don't like. What we need to realize is that in a certain sense everything is kitsch and nothing is kitsch. But if you look at the career of an artist like Jeff Koons, how can you condemn kitsch, since everything he does is based on kitsch, and is an ironic consciousness of kitsch, and even an attempt to turn kitsch into high art and to prevent people from making the same kind of kitsch as they always did. There's a case going on at the moment where a firm is making bookends, to hold books together, with 2 balloon dogs on either end. And Jeff Koons is suing them because he made huge balloon dogs as sculptures. But those balloon dogs in turn are based on things which people of a non-artistic, certainly not in the art world, made, and they are not original to Koons. So there's a recession of originalities. Nobody knows where balloon dog actually begins. And I think that the idea of kitsch is simply a defense put up by professional intellectuals against what they don't like or what they don't want to think about. And they, of course, they immediately reverse themselves when you get an artist making use of supposedly kitsch sources, but who fits into their, or apparently fits into within their intellectual parameters. So what I would say is that kitsch is a meaningless term. I mean, to say kitsch is simply a label which people stick onto things they don't like. And that is doesn't seem to me a very fruitful thing to do. We have a very ambiguous attitudes towards what is called popular culture or mass market culture. On the one hand, the intellectual tends to despise it. Oh, it's kitsch. Oh, it's not for me. On the other hand, when kitsch is parodied, used ironically, or apparently ironically, used as source material, it suddenly becomes intellectually respectable. Well, I've seen an awful lot of extremely badly written, torturous explanations about why some things are kitsch and why some things which look exactly like them are not. or artistically virtuous. I would rather not enter into that into that situation. That you know that kitsch is also to do with cultural positioning. That is, if you belong to one kind of culture, you may innocently accept as attractive, amusing, covetable things which another section of culture condemns. But then a further section of that will say, oh, if these are taken up by people like us, then they cease to be kitsch and become art. I think what you've got to think here is a good comparison is to think of various kinds of traditional trade. That is, where, if you think of the whole history of trade beads, beads made for trade, made for essentially as a kind of coinage, where you go to tribal people and say, here are my beads, can I have your gold? Or here are my beads, can I have your fur? Or here are my beads, can I have your feathers? At what point are the beads kitsch in this exchange? That is, are they kitsch simply when they are in the hands of the would-be sophisticated trader? Are they kitsch when they get into tribal hands and are used for tribal decoration? Are they kitsch when those tribal decorations in their turn become fashionable in cultivated, or so-called cultivated, sophisticated circles? I once made a series of photographs in the garden of a celebrated pyramid, pagoda in Suzhou in China. And there were a whole series of displays which in European terms would have been kitsch. Piggies, figures of little piggies enjoying themselves in human pursuits, this kind of thing. Well, these were the Chinese equivalents in their society of what chinoiserie would have been in an 18th century society. And I paired these photographs for an exhibition with photographs taken of the figures which ornament the Chinese pavilion in the gardens of Potsdam Palace, built for Frederick the Great. In both cases what you had was a kind of cultural misunderstanding which produced a new kind of image. But whether it was fair to call the Chinese displays kitsch when they were addressed not to you as a European visitor, but mainly to a Chinese public, I'm not at all sure. I may say, is there such a thing as kitsch in Chinese terms? Mm-hmm. And yet we often think that modern Chinese things are kitsch. Hmm. Talking about Neo-Academism as it appeared in St. Petersburg and is now in the second or third generation, it is suddenly reviving and making steps in Moscow, which was always opposed to it. Well, there are parallel situations. The most conspicuous is what has happened in Italy, where there is a sharp division between there's a great Italian push for conceptualism at the moment, which is exemplified by the contents of the Zaha Hadid designed Maxi Art Museum of the 21st Century in Rome. And at the same time, there are great numbers of Italian painters making figurative painting, and most of them are allied to a movement which is called pittura colta, that is, cultivated painting, and cultivated in the sense of its awareness of art styles, its awareness of the past. Well, pittura colta has been remarkably durable. It derives from the late work of De Chirico, when De Chirico tried to make out that he was an old master reborn, and it really started officially in the year after De Chirico's death, that is, the birth year of pittura colta is 1979, and it's still going, I mean to say 3 or 4 generations later. Well, I think what that's about is that the Italians in many respects were postmodern before anybody else, and that the pittura colta contains a questioning of the Italian past, which perhaps Neo-Academism doesn't in Russia. Then again, you have a different kind of realist postmodern painting, which is made both in Spain and in Latin America. That is, Spain and the Spanish schools beyond the seas. In almost all South American countries there are realist artists, certainly in Colombia, Chile, sent in Argentina. What I'm doing now is a lot of exhibitions which are being put, which are under the phrase, under the banner, are polemically small, and they are exhibitions which attempt to tackle 2 things. One is simply purely economic, and that is that small works are much easier to transport and much cheaper than big ones. And therefore you can do ambitious exhibitions in terms of names, numbers of artists, for remarkably little money. But also they are connected to the fact that what I am witnessing among young artists is a reaction against rhetoric. That is, the huge, ambitious works which artists seemed to aspire to make until quite recently are now beginning to fall out of popularity with young artists. Well, there are practical reasons, again, for this: lack of space, lack of market, this kind of thing, but also a reaction against this kind of enormous sort of grandiosity which seemed to overtake modern art in the wake of abstract expressionism. Actually, abstract expressionism happened in New York lofts, where there was plenty of wall space, and where people didn't at first actually regard the paintings they were making as permanent. They made them, they put them up. If they got destroyed, it didn't matter. Well, now our museums are jammed with enormously ambitious and no doubt enormously valuable in financial terms works. Well, what are young artists to do? I mean, to say, are they making, even if the museums are willing to buy, those works just go into storerooms. They just become another warehouse. It's filled with ambitious canvases which nobody will see. Well, I think artists want to be in contact with the public, and this is a way of doing it. And it's not, as I discovered, having invented the phrase and the manner, I thought I was doing something entirely new, or at least I hoped I was. It's not quite true. That long before I got onto the idea, more and more artists were making small works. I mean, so they're making in Germany, a lot of the Leipzig school artists, who have been very influential in Germany in recent years, instead of making great big pictures, which they do of course sometimes, but they're making little ones, and they're making a series. And I think the same thing is beginning to happen in a widespread kind of way. Well, it's helpful in many respects. That is one exhibition which I'm planning with co-curators. It's from a museum in California, and it will all be on paper and it will all be unframed. We hope to have as many as 100 artists represented. Well, in terms of names of artists, a variety of styles, this will be the largest show of contemporary British art ever shown in California. And it will all go to the museum in a package sent via FedEx, which no doubt will be about that fat and will be about this big. Well, just think of it. An exhibition which goes into package that size, it's a revolution. And similarly, I'm doing, with varying groups of collaborators, I'm doing a show for, a polemically small concept will be part of a show in Klaipėda, Lithuania. We're talking of doing one in Buenos Aires. I'm in negotiations, having done a very small one in England, to do a rather larger one next year in an official space in London. Well, this is, in a certain sense, it's a revolutionary concept, because though we're using institutions where we can get them, they turn the usual institutional, it's got to be huge and grand thing, upside down. But it also has another, and to me, very important aspect. And that is, I've said to the Lithuanians, and I'm certainly saying to the Argentinians, that what I want to do is to show British artists in the polemically small format in confrontation with artists from their cultures. That is, I want to have Lithuanian works facing British ones, and I want to have Argentinian works equally facing British ones. Because I think that the whole arrogance of exporting culture, saying, that's what we do, there it is, we're superior, I don't like that. What I want is a conversation. And the other thing is, I know extremely well from a publicity point of view, that if I include the local artists, guess what? I'll get an audience. They will come in because they will be curious to see how they relate to what is coming in from outside, and that therefore there's a possibility of a conversation, even perhaps a possibility of debate. That is what you want. You don't want just to say, take it or leave it.